Shabbat shalom, everyone. And I apologize to everyone online. Apparently, when I moved, I disappeared. So for anyone online, I do apologize about that. And actually, I'd like to just start a little bit differently today as I talk about what I'm going to talk about. And the first thing I want to do is to just go through the room, and if people could one by one please say their names. So I'm going to start here. Yes, please. Okay. Great. Great. And we'll start in the front. I have no idea where that's coming. So let's start with David. Galila. Yes? Okay. And then we'll start in the back there. Wonderful. There's a reason we've done that. And as I talk, I hope the reason becomes very clear, but I will point it out later. I'm focusing on names. And there's a reason I'm focusing on names. Vadim, my husband, and I, we have 5 children. They all have biblical first names. It's Margalit, Rebecca, Isaac, Ezra, Chava. And actually, what starts to happen with those names, we hadn't even thought about that, but we started to notice certain things were occurring. So, for instance, when they were little, we would take day trips. We would go in Ontario to Amish towns, and we'd be walking around there. We'd be going into the shops or the stores, and suddenly everybody there is speaking German to us. They're speaking English to everybody else, but they're speaking German to us. And we're looking at each other, and we can't quite figure out why they're switching into German. And then it hits me, because of the names. We're actually, when I'm calling the kids, they're hearing me call Rebecca, Isaac, Ezra. When Vadim is calling me, they're hearing Rachel. These are, from their point of view, Old Testament names. So as far as they're concerned, we were an Amish family who has left the Amish community, and given by the names, therefore, they're going to speak German to us. And we were just baffled by it. We couldn't quite understand until we realized it's the names. And I asked someone about it, and they did say, yes, we're noticing the names of your children. And that was the assumption that was made at that time. So names actually convey important things. And Jewishly, we know that we name our children after people. It's a way we have of honoring the memory of the people. And generally, we tell the story of the person. So everyone who bears that name knows who they're named after and knows the story of that person. It's what we all do. That's how we create memory, by using their names, telling their stories. But what happens is the culture around us starts to react to these names, as we had that example of when we would take the kids out, and then I started to notice the confusion of it, because Margalit, people thought it was a Spanish name. It's a Hebrew name. But from the sound of it, they're thinking it's Spanish. And so they start to relate to her and us as if somehow we have Spanish that is in the language as well. So far we have German, we have Spanish, all coming just because they're hearing the names. Rebecca, our next daughter, was often called Rachel, and I couldn't figure out why. And I finally asked someone, and they said, well, they were apologetic. They said, I know it's a biblical name, I know it starts with an R, and I know that it's a matriarch, so headed to Rachel. So Rebecca becomes Rachel because of the confusion of the name. Isaac and Ezra. Isaac and Ezra were often told, and are still told, they don't look like Isaac and Ezra. And we couldn't figure out, how do you look like an Isaac and an Ezra? And finally we asked someone, and they said, because Isaac and Ezra makes them think about African-American athletes. And so they look at Isaac and Ezra, our sons, and they say, you don't look like an Isaac and an Ezra. And that actually made me think, what's going on? How do you actually make that association? So I went and I did a little bit of research. And for anyone who has the name Isaac, you should know that in Ghana, 1 in 76 people are called Isaac. In Uganda, 1 in 200 called Isaac. In Kenya, 1 in 300. In Malawi and Zambia, 1 in 200. This is a very common name. In Israel, it's 1 in 120. I love that. That if you look in Israel, 1 in 120 people are going to be called Isaac. Then we get to the US, it's 1 in 5,000. When we get to Canada, it's 1 in 7,000. And just for fun, I looked in Russia, it's 1 in 2.5 million. So we're watching, where is this name circulating most? Africa. And so the association actually is happening. So I went to check Ezra as well. Ezra in Israel, 1 in 1,200. In the US, 1 in 35,000. In Canada, 1 in 75,000. In Russia, we're at 8.5 million. But head to Africa. In Kenya, 1 in 2,000. Tanzania, 1 in 3,000. Madagascar, 1 in 5,000. They're right. If we look at the world statistics, our Isaac and Ezra do not look like the way the world sees Isaac and Ezra. Those are the names. And then we get to Chava, and of course the name Chava is just going to speak for itself. She learned very quickly. When someone asked her, how do you spell that? She says, phlegm, H-A-V-A. That's how you would spell Chava. It's a difficult name, and she's maneuvered with it, and clearly it either speaks into a culture or doesn't speak into a culture. The Torah tells us always use someone's name. And in fact, this week, we read about how everybody should give half a shekel, because then we can count the shekels, we can count the coins. We're not allowed to count people. So if you do want to figure out how many people you have, tell them to give you something. The brilliance is, of course, they're giving a coin, which now becomes a tax, a levy, which then goes to support the priests. So all the way through, it's going to be wonderful. But it solved the problem. If we can't count people, how do we know how many people we have? If we can't reduce people to numbers, how are we supposed to count people? We're being backed into a corner. We don't know quite how it is that we're supposed to be doing this. And it's so strong that we have traditions in Judaism not to count people. We do not assign a number to a person. It's bone-chilling to us. We know this. A person should never be reduced to a number because it dehumanizes them. And the Torah told us, don't do that. So one of the first challenges we're going to have is, how do you count a minyan? The thing we need, we know it's 10, but we're not allowed to count people. How are we going to count a minyan? When the cantor and I met each other, we had this discussion. And actually, what we're told is, traditionally, you don't count people, you say a verse. You say something that has 10 words in it. And now you're assigning a word to each person, and you're saying the verse. So that we had in common. My verse was, Hoshiat amecha uvarech et nachlatecha urein v'nasem ad olam. Save your people, bless your inheritance, watch over them, and carry them forever. In Hebrew, it's 10 words. The cantor's was the bracha for hamotzi lechem min haaretz. And if you count that bracha, it's 10 words. So each of us had the way to count the minyan. We had it to different verses. But they're beautiful verses, but they're not blessings. We're not blessing the people in the room. We're finding a way to count the people in the room, because we can start when we get a minyan, but we can't count people. So our hands are tied. And we have this beautiful tradition of don't count people. Assign a word to each person. Count the words. Same thing that we learned from the shkalim. So we get very creative about it. There are blessings around names. We bless our children when we name them after the people we loved, the people who impacted us, influenced us, wonderful people. We bless our children with these names. We create the blessing through the name. And likewise, God forbid, if we ever curse someone, we say, Yamach Shemam, may their name be erased. Because to us, that's the worst thing that can happen. There is a man who lived in the 20th century, a murderous, evil, beyond words man, whose name will never be uttered in the sanctuary. Because we won't. We want that name erased. That's the worst we can do to someone, is say, you have no legacy. You have no connection to the future. You are done. We have erased you. Now what's happening is we're hearing it in the cultures around us. March 2019, a white supremacist opens fire in 2 mosques in Christchurch, New Zealand. He murders 50 people and wounds hundreds as they're engaged in prayer. Here's what the Prime Minister of New Zealand, Prime Minister Arden said to her parliament, quote, "He sought many things from his act of terror, but one was notoriety. That is why you will never hear me mention his name." End quote. And we immediately understood what she was saying. Erase his name. It's impactful. It's one of the strongest things we can do. Not referring to someone by name is not an oversight, it's a choice. It's a statement that we are making through the silence of the name. Yesterday in Minnesota, Kim Potter, a former police officer, was sentenced to 2 years in jail. This is the officer who accidentally used her gun instead of her taser. And an innocent black man died because she aimed at his chest. She says she thought she was holding her taser, and she killed him. And we watched the trial, and we watched what she was saying, and we watched everything that was happening, and no one disputed what happened. It was clear what happened. As we look at the sentence that came out yesterday, she got 2 years. That's far less than what the standard would be for the accidental taking of a life in those circumstances. So while some people were feeling relieved and justified that she got any kind of jail time, other people were saying, what was that? Why did she get less? The man she killed was Daunte Wright. And there's a huge controversy going on now. Should she have gotten the less sentence? Are there racial issues involved? What was going on in the moment? What was going on after the moment? What was going on in the courtroom? What was going on in the judge's mind? Are we encountering what has now become coined as, quote, white woman's tears trumping justice? How much of that was going on? And the debate goes on and on and on, and it should go on and on and on. All of these issues are important. All of them need to be discussed. But there was a moment of clarity that happened as well. And it was during the sentencing hearing when the mother of Dwayne Wright stood up. Katie Wright said, as she was addressing the court, she said, "I will only refer to her as the defendant." Quote, "She never once said his name, and for that I'll never forgive you." End quote. Out of everything that happened, as she spoke about the woman who took the life of her son, she focused in on that and said, "Why couldn't you say his name once as you were talking about it? To you, he continues to be the driver, and you've removed his name." This week, the Torah is clear to us. We are forbidden to reduce people to less than their names. The Talmud says there are 3 names that we carry with us. One is the name we are given. The second is the name we are known by. And the third is the name we create. Those are our names, and we want them used. I personally am not good at remembering names. I never have been. And I always feel bad about it, and I always feel embarrassed about it, and I have learned humility through it, that I will ask people again and again, "I'm sorry, I've forgotten your name. I'm sorry, could you please repeat your name?" Because it's important to get the name, even if it makes me uncomfortable or I'm embarrassed that I couldn't remember it. It doesn't matter. It's too important. It's a Jewish value to use our names. We listen in the Torah this week as it tells us. We read the newspaper as we see the impact and the importance of it. We hear politicians saying, "I'm choosing to say or not say the name," because it matters. It's meaningful. The names that we all said at the beginning, they're precious, they're a unique thing to each of us, and we all bear them so proudly. Shabbat shalom.